Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Coach's Corner University podcast. Today we are doing a Q&A, and a very recent guest of the podcast is back again, Austin Stout. Welcome.
Sir. Quickest repeat guest.
Quickest repeat guest, probably
Okay,
being
cool.
hosted 2 weeks in a row.
Can I get a plaque for that?
Yeah, sure. It'll be handwritten though.
You should have like awards at the end of the year, like they do at those business coaching.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and I'll walk the stage.
Done. Consider it done, sir.
That's all I ask, really. That's all I ask.
What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into like one of the scrap bins on my street in like one of the trailer parks and just grab like a piece of wood and like carve Austin and misspell your name in it.
With a screwdriver.
Yeah, exactly.
Really poor
Exactly.
craftsmanship.
Um, I'm actually very excited. So for those who don't know, Austin is actually my wife Olivia's coach. So someone who, you know, I respect to the highest degree when it comes to his expertise in the field. And he comes with a bit of a different approach than most people because he has a background in functional health, with which I truly understand, truly appreciate. And I think it's important to point out, like, a lot of the value that I think people get from coaches is not necessarily that they have, the best plan or whatever it might be, but they know how to troubleshoot problems should they ever arise. And I think
Sure.
that's something that you definitely bring to the table. So, first question, this actually just a caveat. So this is going to be a much more technical podcast, a lot more X's and O's than we usually get. So the first question is going to be surrounding insulin usage within bodybuilding or powerlifting. Um, Typically, insulin is used in a weight gain scenario. You're trying to increase the anabolic stimulus of the food that you're eating. I would love to know from you if we could give a broad overview of the differences between a long-acting insulin like Lantus versus a short-acting insulin like Humalog. When are these things put in? What are some markers that you would look to as indicators that they would be, I don't want to use the word required, but potentially beneficial? And what are some things that you would watch for during use to make
Okay.
sure that, we're staying healthy?
I think the easiest comparison we can kind of make between the two is that if we look at um, other PEDs, we have different esters, right? So we have
Mhm.
like testosterone, we have an anthate, cypionate, and then we would have something like a propionate potentially, right?
Or
So,
suspension for the real
or yeah,
juice.
or suspension. So really the difference is what? Half-life. However, once these things are cleaved from the ester or the carrier, they're all the same molecule,
Right.
right? So insulin we can kind of think of in the same way as we have a fast acting, we have a slow acting, or a basal, as we would call it, technical term. There's some others that are maybe a little more in between. Like here in the States, there's a lot of generics like Novolin, the R's, like Novolin R, which is a little bit slower than a log, but it's still faster. Or we actually have something called Novolin N, which is pretty cool. Pro tip, by the way, Novolin N is over the counter in almost the entire US, and so is Novolin R. A lot of people know about R, but they don't know about N.
Interesting.
So the cool thing about that,
Adds to
now,
Walmart list.
yeah, so yes, it is over the counter at Walmart. The interesting thing about that, Novolin N is not a 24-hour insulin. You'll see kind of mixed data on that, maybe like 12 to 16 hours, maybe 18 hours. So it would be something where you would have kind of like an AM and a PM dose, but it is very much a basal insulin.
Interesting.
The other cool thing about that comes straight from a pharmacy from the refrigerator, and it's good every single time.
Mm,
Thought, right?
yeah.
So shipping, transit, heat, like all that stuff, people fit, that's a concern sometimes. So just a little tidbit on that. But yeah, we have these different insulins that have different half-lives essentially. They all largely do the same thing in that they are going to partition nutrients that are in the bloodstream. Now, there are some things with basal insulins like Lantus especially that may be slightly beneficial. They say Lantus has maybe a higher binding capacity than something like a short acting. Now, how much does that actually play into real world results, I don't know. I
Right.
mean, I don't know if that's anything that's going to be worth really arguing over. I mean, someone would like to argue over it, but I'm not going to.
Absolutely, the internet will argue over it.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue over, because we have bigger fish to fry, right?
Yeah.
Which is of course how to actually correctly apply stuff reasonably, you
Hmm.
know. So in a growth in a hypertrophy scenario, we have to keep a couple things in mind. One is our pancreas produces quite a bit of insulin on its own, like on a regular basis. So, you know, in a normal person, talking like non-diabetic, you know, we may produce a basal, just like insulin that's kind of like trickling out throughout the day.
Yeah.
You know, we may make 20, 30, 40, 50 units even a day on our
Obviously,
own.
yeah, depending on how many calories you're eating, for sure.
Right. So there's going to be a lot of variance there. But my point is, like, we're not only making 5 units, equivalent of 5 units of insulin on our own. So when, like, if you see someone taking 10 units or 20 units, it's not really an astronomical number in the grand scheme.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's that. The second important thing to keep in mind is that from a dosing, or from like a pancreatic perspective, insulin doesn't shut you down in the way that taking like
Hmm.
exogenous androgen shuts you down. So, like, for example, if you required 40, equivalent to 40 IUs for the day, and you took 20, your pancreas will pick up the other 20,
Right.
right? So I think that when we take that into consideration from a dosing perspective, you don't necessarily have to try to max out your insulin requirements with exogenous insulin,
I think that's
right?
a different, and I think that right there is even still a different school of thought than, the old school prevailing wisdom that, you eat food to match your insulin dose versus titrate up your insulin to match your food.
Right. So that's, and that gets tricky because, you know, we have these like kind of ratios that float around when it comes, especially with fast acting insulin. You know, you should take 1 IU per 10 grams of carbs. Like, that's
Right.
a standard thing, or or per whatever. And we know that that varies. We know that that varies based on food intake, size of your meals, how sensitive you are to that insulin, how sensitive your cells actually are
Even how
to the
hot it is
insulin.
outside.
Yeah, temperature, pancreatic function. So, like, we should think about too, it's really, there's kind of two things that play into insulin sensitivity primarily in this case. One, how sensitive are the cells to the insulin or the
Hmm.
glucose? And then how well is the actual pancreas functioning? How well are the beta cells functioning to produce it? That's why we see in type, you know, in diabetics, for example, well, if we took an extreme like type 1 diabetics, their beta cells don't work, right? So they have to take insulin. We see a type 2 diabetic, they have both, they are having both issues as they become more progressed in that disease, where their pancreas is working less because it's, those beta cells are dying, and their cells are more resistant to the
Hmm.
insulin. So they don't really have a, if you're very progressed as a type 2, you're pretty much just, everything you're taking is keeping you alive at that point, right? Like, your pancreas isn't doing that much anymore.
Hmm.
Um, but for bodybuilders, again, kind of going back to that, as people, because a lot of people are concerned about, you know, going hypoglycemic and timing, and like they don't want to have to sit there and like look at their watch and, you know, do all that shit. You don't have my point there is, like, you don't have to try to maximize that dose
Exactly. Yeah.
right out of the gate. You, because for one, we don't know what that is. You can
Hmm.
guess. I mean, you can take a guess at it, but you don't know. And two, it's just kind of a pain in the butt. And it's another thing that you have to worry about. And that's also another reason that basals are appealing to
Yep.
people, right? I think basal insulins are appealing for two reasons. Like, A, muscle growth, repair, recovery is a slow process.
Yeah. It happens
So,
over the course of 24 hours.
right. So, like, if we're thinking about fast acting versus slow acting, yes, we will get this. We can take this Humalog or Novolog or whatever it is and get this mealtime support, but that's a meal. Like, that is
Hmm.
not, like, how much is that actually contributing to muscle growth in
Right.
the grand scheme of things? This acute bolus of
Hmm.
insulin, probably not that much, right? Maybe a good
No.
pump,
Yeah, exactly.
But
And that's what I was going to say. Like, I think, in my experience implementing insulin through that peri-workout window is
right,
definitely going to have the best bang for your buck. But if you're just taking, a Humalog with every meal, that's, yeah,
you're probably better off just using a basal at that point
exactly. Yeah.
and calling it a day. And I would even go as far as to say, like if we're checking glucose, for example, if we can check a fasting glucose, that's still going to give us some indication of if we're taking enough basal, right? Because it's
Mhm.
always kind of there. But if we're seeing our fasting glucose is I don't know, 85, and then we're seeing that our postprandial glucoses are climbing more and more and more away from that fasting glucose, we're losing sensitivity at that point because we're
Right.
not handling those meals. Our pancreas is not handling those meals sufficiently. So we have to
Mhm.
ask, we can put in the Humalog, or are we just getting to the point where we're getting too fat and too insulin resistant, right? And because I think that insulin gets used as a way to buffer that, but I can control glucose indefinitely, you know? Like
Yeah.
we can just keep taking more until you're so fat and so insulin resistant that you're not gaining any muscle at
Right.
that point. So there's a point of diminishing return there, right?
Yeah. What I've often seen is like, especially with insulin, a little goes a long way.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the more that I do this, the more that I lean towards that and just realize that most people, and this is not to say that people shouldn't eat big, gain weight, be afraid to put on fat, but like getting super fat just for most people is just not beneficial. Most people.
I honestly, I couldn't agree more. And I think what I'm seeing with the clients that I have implemented an insulin protocol with, they're the clients whom are leaner, stay leaner, and run into the issue of I can't eat enough food to continue to push my weight up. So we need to make the food that we're eating more efficiently metabolized.
Right. Yep. Yep. Improving partitioning. And another anecdote that I've seen is, and I'm not the only one that has said this, so I'm not like trademarking this, but this
Please
idea
do though.
of, yeah, sure, this idea of like resting your pancreas, like not taxing it as much. So something
Yeah.
that I've seen anecdotally is that if you took two people, the exact same person, and you fed them up to the exact same amount and the exact same length of time, the person that took insulin versus the person that didn't, the one that took insulin tends to resensitize or at least regain glucose control quicker after their growth phase is over versus the one that does not.
So I can back that up 100% because this is something that I've only recently began educating myself on. And for those that know, I'm not going to do anything with a client until I'm absolutely sure that I can do it safely. So I started with my most, we'll call him competitive uh, physique athlete. The last 8 weeks of his off season were a health phase. So instead of pushing drugs, we backed them down and we implemented an insulin protocol. Very conservative, but we kept his food high. What ended up happening is he continued to grow during this health phase. And then when
Yeah,
we pulled it out, this motherfucker is 10 weeks out, still eating almost 4,000 calories. And his body composition is the exact same as it was 4 weeks out of his last show.
right.
And I'm like, there has to be something going on here.
But he didn't get really fat, did he?
Never got fat.
that's that is the biggest thing because I think I want to everyone loves to take shit out of context
For
first
sure.
and foremost. So like if I say that that's going to make you regain sensitivity quicker, I think that they might abuse it and get too fat, and that's not going to make you regain sensitivity quicker. Is like don't take
Yeah.
that, don't take it that way. But yeah, I mean, anecdotally, I've definitely seen that happen on multiple occasions with people, males and females, um, where they just have they have an easier time regaining glucose control and sensitivity back after the completion of that surplus, essentially,
Yeah, for
right?
sure.
So, so we can kind of, with all that being said, we can kind of talk about, dosages and implementation and stuff there as well. Um, I'll be completely honest. I'm much more of a fan of the basal insulins. And
Yeah, same.
I think mostly from a practicality standpoint. And I think the fact that hypertrophy being such a long process is also a factor, but I think from a simplicity standpoint, it's just a lot easier for
Hmm.
people, and it still serves the purpose that we need it to serve. Um, so we can get away with starting with small dosages and then just kind of monitor as we go. So a small dose might be something like 5 units in the morning, and then assess from there based on glucose.
Yep.
Unless you are like peeled out of your freaking mind, 5 units is not going to do anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's not going to do anything to anyone. And the fact of the matter is, even if it dipped your sugar a little low, you're going to have your body's going to liberate some fatty acids. It's going to liberate some glucose. It's going to liberate some energy substrates back
Hmm.
into the body and help you because it's so slow acting,
Right.
right? So the chances of you having an issue with that are basically nothing at that point,
Yeah.
right? And then you can, of course, titrate dosage. So some people I do find, because we know like Lantus being the most popular one, that's kind of the one that everyone likes to use.
Right.
Um, it is toted as 24 hours or maybe some variance up and down there, but you probably have a little bit of drop off potentially with your serum level of insulin by the time you got to that next AM dose. So some people might benefit from doing like a split dose AM PM schedule. Um,
Interesting. I think there definitely would be the need for education on the client side if they were worried about going hypo overnight.
Yeah, well, they actually wouldn't go hypo overnight, and for one, but yeah, that's a concern. People are like, well, I don't want to take this dosing at night because I'm not eating. Normally, normally with that, by the end of the day, your glucose is the highest it's going to be anyhow, and you're fully saturated at that point. So, like,
Sure.
the chances of that are like I'll say this: I've never seen it actually happen to anyone. So I'm not.
Me
I
neither.
don't want to speak. I don't want to speak in absolutes because we're talking about insulin, but I just don't really see that happening with people. Now, some caveats to that would be people that people that have a lot of, are very, very high stress, have like very low adrenal function, have a lot of adrenal dysfunction there. They definitely want to be extra careful. First, they should be working on that anyhow. But
Naturally.
second thing is like they need to be pretty careful with that because they are the individuals that will have some, big ebbs and flows based on their stress, essentially. But outside of those individuals, the basal is going to be pretty simple. There's not really a whole lot of thought that goes into it other than establish baseline dose, monitor glucose, and work from there. Now, once we get to that point, there's got to be an upper limit on that too, right?
Yeah.
Because, like we said before, if we're having to take exorbitant amounts of insulin, then we're probably becoming resistant. So higher amounts, I could see a case where, a slightly higher amount might be warranted for short periods of time, especially in people that are very big, people that are eating a lot of food. But I'm never really wanting people to be taking double or triple the amount of normal production for, you know, 4 months or 6 months. Like we're resistant at that point. We're far
Well,
beyond sensitivity.
and I think that comes down to like we want to keep the goal the goal. And at
Right.
that point, the goal of that assisting the pancreas, we're not assisting the pancreas anymore.
Right.
If you have to go that far, maybe it's time to back off, resensitize, and then go at it again. I think this is also an argument. I forget which podcast I heard you speak about it on, but the argument for low and slow, right?
Mhm.
Set it and forget it. let it do its job, and
Yep.
let's just keep eating, keep training hard.
Yep. Yep.
I've seen
Less,
better results with that than anything else.
but don't, I mean, we could say that probably applies to just about everything in the plan. It's
100%.
like
100% we could, yeah.
the less stuff people have to think about, the better.
Always.
Easy, and nor so, another thing there too is most people are probably taking growth hormone with their
Right.
insulin too. So that's a factor. So we do know growth hormone will raise glucose to some extent. More would be more.
Mhm.
If we're talking bigger dosages, we're going to have some more increase in glucose there.
So if I'm taking a full pin of Serostim a day,
Yeah, well, you're probably going to need some help on that one, right? Potentially. Um, I so I had an interesting conversation about that with someone too, and I kind of, because you will hear a lot of people say that I this like idea that GH raises glucose, that to me is not that big of a problem. It's not as big of a problem as people make it out to be.
I would
And
agree.
and the reason that I think it's a big problem for some people is that they're already insulin resistant to begin with. So again, I'll say this: I've never seen someone that's in good off-season shape that has good insulin sensitivity, that's doing everything right, that has been like, yep, GH ruined my off season because I got too insulin resistant. I'm like, bullshit. No, it didn't. you know, like it just doesn't happen. If you're fat and you're overeating, then sure, right?
So let's play on that a little bit. So what would be kind of the upper limit of, or even just starting off with, what sort of metrics would you be tracking during this period to make sure, number one, our dosing is appropriate, and number two, maybe when we need to reset?
Okay. So let's say we can go back to maybe that 5 IU starting dose. So
Sure.
that's pretty low. Realistically, it's probably gonna have to go up for most people. So let's say we start there and you're like, okay, well, that's not quite enough. So maybe we settle on 10. Maybe we settle on 10 IUs, everything's nice and smooth. Something we're really going to be looking for there is that need for insulin going to go up? Yes, right? To some extent, it's going to go up because we're going to keep scaling food and we're probably going to lose a little bit of sensitivity through that growth phase. How quickly is it going up is a huge factor. Because if I'm seeing that every week, we're like, oh shit, we got to add 5 IUs every week or 4 IUs every week. Now that's a problem because
And
then
and you're
we're
determining that
losing.
increase in dosage based on the fasted blood glucose numbers, or based on what?
Well, fasted glucose and maybe postprandial glucose too, if we're looking at
Okay.
both of those
Okay.
as well. So if we're seeing, I think that if we're seeing that we have to, I'll go a step further with that. If we're seeing that we have to increase insulin very frequently, that's a problem. And if we're also seeing that we have to increase insulin dosages even without food increases,
Ah,
that's a
there we
problem.
go. Yep.
There's a big one right there because it wouldn't be unusual for me to think like, hey, because deeper in the off season, metabolically you're kind of at your ceiling. You're not really adapting anymore, so it's not like you're making food bumps every week at that point
Right.
anyhow,
You're just kind of
right?
letting it ride. Yep.
Yeah, you might, dude, it could be like 4 or 6 weeks before you make another increase at times, right? When you get really deep into that. But if I'm having to make these insulin adjustments every week, even though I haven't bumped food, like, well, that's telling me something,
For
right? We're
sure.
losing
Yeah.
sensitivity. So either A, it's too much food potentially, or B, we just weren't in a good enough position maybe to begin with
Hmm.
from a sensitivity standpoint. So that's how I would say that if you are in having to make slight adjustments based on food increases, fine, good.
Totally.
That's fair. I have no argument with that. That makes sense, especially unless you're increasing, like 5 grams of carbs or something, which nobody's doing that. So, um, but if you're making any reasonable increase, sure, cool, roll with it.
So main variables there that we're tracking: fasted blood glucose. We're trying to keep it, ideally below 95, somewhere in there,
Yeah,
especially
I
towards the
don't.
end of the off season.
I am not someone that's be like, you're listen, your glucose isn't going to be 75 at that point. Like it's okay, right? It's probably not even going to be 80, and that's okay. You know, it's
Yeah.
fine.
So for Canadian conversion, we're talking like below 5, 5.5, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's stay on the let's stay on the off-season weight gain train. Managing appetite while trying to increase food. This is something that personally I've kind of run into because I'm trying to prioritize my gut health. So I'm eating more fiber. I'm not someone who does have to eat a lot of food to gain, like
Which is
40,
nice.
4,500 calories, and I'm, a pound every other week kind of thing. But even eating that 4,500 calories for me with the amount of fiber I'm eating is brutal. How do you balance? And I know there's going to be a tipping point here, gut health, GI, fiber intake with these climbing caloric numbers.
So you brought up the 40, like the 4,500 calorie mark. The first thing I would say is that high is totally relevant to the person. So 4,500 calories might seem like a heck of a lot of food for somebody to eat. So like
Right.
the people that are out there eating 6,000, you don't have to just say like, oh, you're only eating 4,000, you're weak. I'm like, listen, everyone's homeostatic set point is different. You know,
Mhm.
like 4,000 may feel just as difficult as 6,000 for some people. So you have to think about that. The so there's a few main issues that we run into with calorie surplus and GI, and they vary a little bit from the issues we run into with our typical like lifestyle or person that's been doing too many preps, like these high stress yo-yo dieting type of people.
Mhm.
In off-season scenarios, inflammation,
Okay.
just general systemic inflammation. So we're talking higher susceptibility to things like IBD type issues, Crohn's colitis, diverticulitis, um, you know, inflammatory disease, right?
Mhm.
Two is bacterial overgrowth is just as much of a issue with surplus as it is a high stress, contest prep. The difference is that a lot of the time, I don't want to say all the time, because that's not the case, but a lot of the time, what I see is just kind of like everything overgrows in those folks. So for the people that are listening, so if like I use a lot of GI maps and things, right? So I'll see those results. Kind of common patterns that we would see is we have sections on there that would show commensal bacteria, that's our good stuff typically, and then dysbiotic bacteria, that's kind of our bad stuff, right? The pathogens, we don't really want overgrowth of that. And a lot of individuals that come in from really high stress environments, contest prep, history of undereating, whatever, we see a lot of dysbiosis, which means that we'll see high dysbiotic bacteria, and we'll see maybe sometimes low commensal bacteria or maybe even normal, but high dysbiotic.
Okay.
Whereas an off-season bodybuilders, male and female, I tend to see more cases where kind of everything pushes up in
Mm.
conjunction with each other. And that's not always the case. Sometimes we still see that ratio skew, but I see more of the kind of like proportionate overgrowth
Gotcha.
that
Yeah.
way, right? So when we get this overgrowth, there's a couple reasons that it kind of slows you down and makes you feel bloated and makes you feel uncomfortable. One is that these dysbiotic bacteria, a lot of them produce gas. So they produce hydrogen and methane gases. So that's why when we see people with pretty pronounced SIBO, they wake up in the morning and they already have this like air belly, right? Because
Mhm.
it's not food. It's not a food belly. It's literally gas. It's like gas is being created by this bacteria and it's like pushing out against your intestines are swollen essentially, right?
Mhm.
So when we have this, we start to have we start to have issues with our nutrient absorption and also motility, because these bacteria, they communicate with each other, we have this gut brain axis, right? So when we get really full and we already have a lot of bacteria in there, we're getting less hunger signaling, right?
Right. Yeah.
So we see this we see two two things happen. One is we're fuller for longer between meals. You know, when you're in a deficit, you're like, I'm good, 30 minutes, I could eat again, right?
Right.
Whereas, and of course, it's less calories, but even if you're in a deficit, you could pound down, you could binge on 5,000 calories, and you could probably still eat again, right?
Right.
Because you don't have overgrowth. So we have less hunger signaling because ghrelin levels will go down in response to being fed so much, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And then two, our motility can kind of slow down as well. So motility would be the actual process by which, you know, the muscles are kind of like contracting and moving stuff through.
Mm-hmm.
You know, once we get to that point, we create a lot of intra-abdominal pressure build up, and that's where we start getting things like reflux, right? Like that esophageal flap starts popping open. We're burping up undigested food. You know, we're really uncomfortable.
Good
We're
stuff.
still, yeah, yeah, yeah. The real good stuff. If anyone's eaten enough, they know what we're talking about. And, you know, where you're probably good for meal one, but then by like meal three, you're like, dude, I don't want to be here anymore.
It just feels like
You
the
know,
food's piling on top of itself.
it is, right? It's kind of what's happening. So with that being said, that like let's think about some things we can do. One really simple one is meal frequency, and this is going to be individual. But I want to bring up meal frequency because I think that most people don't realize how long it actually takes for food to travel through your digestive tract. So if you are especially you guys out there, if you are the guys that are pounding down 6, 7 meals a day, you're you're overlapping. Okay. I don't
Mm-hmm.
care if you're eating in a surplus, you're eating big food, you are overlapping digestion. Doesn't matter what you're eating. Okay.
Right.
Because transit time is not that fast.
Mm-hmm.
So so we have that. So you would have to kind of base meal frequency on just like what feels good for you, preference wise. You know, that could be 5, could even be 4. I know 4 sounds kind of alien to somebody that's eating a lot of food, but I've had a lot of guys eat big food and have good success with 4 meals. Are they
Right.
bigger? Sure, they're bigger.
I just reduced my meal frequency from 6 to 5. I already feel better.
Yeah, yes, meals are bigger for sure, but also we have a lot more transit time for me, you know, between meals to let things actually move through and clear, and so we can eat
Mm-hmm.
again. So meal frequency is pretty important there. The second thing we have to remember is we are actively feeding our bacteria way more because of high carbohydrate. You know, we have more fuel for the bacteria because we're eating a lot more.
Yeah.
So, and that's why I theorize that I've seen a lot of cases where people come out of contest prep and they probably already had some GI issues, but it was almost kept at bay a little bit by the fact that they weren't eating that much. And
Right.
then as soon as they binge, you know, they like go nuts post show and it's like bam, blown
That's
up.
that's literally what happened to me.
Right.
Right.
So
You know, came out contest prep. I had some gut issues, wasn't feeling great. And then as soon as I started eating again, bowel obstruction.
and it's like and you don't even have to binge. I don't even want
I
to
didn't
say you
even
have to
go for
binge.
reference. I did not go crazy. I
Yeah,
way
it's
more than before.
just feeding, just like increasing calories. You're naturally going to feed up that bacteria. So there's different types of foods that feed bacteria. Glucose, sugars, like sugars and FODMAPs are our primary thing that's going to feed bacteria. So this is a double-edged sword because on one hand, we want to feed the good stuff, right?
Hmm.
We want to feed that good commensal bacteria, but we don't want to overfeed the dysbiotic bacteria.
Right.
So we I have had success there. Like there's been instances where, especially when we get deep into off seasons with people and food's really high, and I'm like, man, you're still lean enough. We got room, but we're kind of like, we're stuck here on food. I have used lower FODMAP approaches with people deeper in off season as a way to kind of cool off that bacteria while we finish out the rest of the off season. But
Okay.
it's probably not something that I would use for you know, like the whole duration
Well,
of the off season.
that's a common strategy now is just, I only eat white rice and I only eat, squash and
So I'll get into that next.
yeah, please.
So the next problem is what's the first thing that starts to go when you get full?
Yes.
Diversity
Yeah,
in the diet.
diversity is gone.
So fiber goes down, right? And we can even take fiber out of the equation. We'll just say like general variance in the diet,
Hmm.
because you're going to start eliminating stuff that keeps you fuller. Fair.
Right.
You don't want to take up space. Okay. So you're sticking to, you're basically sticking to like meat, animal-based proteins and rice-based starches.
Hmm.
Half Most people don't even eat fruits, they don't even eat vegetables, or very, very little of that stuff, you know. So now what we're starting to create is lack of microbial diversity in the gut. So our bacteria that's being fed, we're kind of like narrowing this window of what's getting fed. So what we have to remember is that dysbiotic bacteria is called opportunistic bacteria. Why? Because that shit'll eat everything. It'll eat anything, it'll eat everything. That's why it grows quicker, right?
Mm.
So it's opportunistic because it takes advantage of multiple fuel sources. So so if we have a lack of diversity in there, what do you think is not getting fed?
Good bacteria.
Good stuff. Good stuff's not getting fed. Bad stuff's like, no big deal. I'm gonna eat this, I'm gonna eat whatever, like whatever you put in here. I'm good to
Hmm.
go. So, and we can even take that a step further, and then we start inserting lots of processed foods and stuff in there to try to pack, calorically dense,
Right.
stuff. Um, which I think has its place to an extent. I think when we use the term process, we should also think about what it is, because, and I don't know what it's like in Canada, but at least in the US, you can get stuff that's minimally processed. It still has really good ingredient profiles. Like it's just,
Yeah,
it'll be like a,
you gotta look, but there it's there.
yeah. So that's not to say that you can't eat, if you're tired of eating rice, that you couldn't eat a rice-based cereal, because you can get rice-based cereal that's like two ingredients.
Puffed rice.
Yeah, I mean, you can get like real basic, easy stuff. So that stuff can definitely be viable. It's just that people are generally resorting to, I'm going to eat McDonald's more, and I'm going to eat,
Five
junk food
Guys.
more, Five Guys, like whatever, to fill calories. Dude, that's such a slippery slope, because if anyone's been in those scenarios and they're really struggling with food and they're like, I'm going to pound some Five Guys tonight. Dude, you don't even want to eat the whole next day.
No, no.
You just ruin, you just offset like your whole next 24 hours
Yeah.
to be able to eat. So that's just not, it's not a great option. So trying to maintain some diversity in there can be helpful. So we run into that fullness issue. So stuff that I've found helpful for me is things like smoothies can be helpful,
Mhm.
blending. And I'm not saying blending your chicken. I'm not saying like blending all your damn chicken and beef up all day. That's ridiculous. I'm just saying that you can get a large amount of variety and diversity in something like that in a smaller package,
Right.
right? And a lot of the time that stuff's not very palatable at that point, because you're like, when you're super hungry, everything tastes good, but when you're not hungry, nothing tastes good.
Yeah, your taste buds just get fatigued.
I don't really want to eat, like, I could probably eat spinach in a prep and be like a pig in shit, because like everything's fine,
Yeah.
I don't really care to eat spinach when I'm like packed full of food, but I could definitely do like a whey isolate shake with maybe some honey in it and some nut butter and some spinach and some blueberries and stuff like that. Nice compact package, lots of diversity, get my fiber in there, digest nice and easy, out
Hmm.
the door. So we can package it in a way that's easier, you know.
Hmm.
Um, so that's helpful. And it doesn't have to be like the whole a case where you're eating, pounds and pounds of this stuff a day necessarily. You can make complementary, each meal, try to have a small amount of fruit, try to have a small amount of veggie. If you can at least do that, you're going to be 90% ahead of everyone else
Yep.
right there. I mean, that's going to get you most of the way there, right?
Yeah.
Um,
One thing that
go ahead.
I was thinking was like, if we're scaling up total food volume anyway, just simply by adding calories to the diet, if you're actually tracking fiber, you may be able to get away with pulling out some of the traditional like fiber only choices, like pulling out maybe switching your oats out for a cream of rice. It's like you can do that
Yep,
because you're eating so much rice throughout the day.
100%. Yep,
Um,
yep,
but we have to be, I've just found it, you have to be so careful.
yep. It's and you should always, and your body tells you, like, if you do make those changes. So for example, if you get to that point, you're like, I'm kind of struggling, and you revert to all those processed foods, and you're like good for a day, but then it gets worse. That's it. Okay, it's telling you stop. Like that's not the solution. You know, your your hunger, your hunger and your digestion will tell you every
Yeah.
time how you feel. And that's of course not taking into consideration like acute changes. You have a really, really stressful day, everyone pisses you off, you don't get enough sleep, something like that. But I'm talking as assuming variables are controlled,
Right.
then you know it shouldn't be that much difference.
I think a big point to make here is that digestion is much more complex than just transit time. It's much more complex than, oh, I love that meal because it's in out of me real quick and I can eat again. It's like that's not necessarily a good thing if that
Yes.
meal is absorbing so fast that it's maybe spiking your blood glucose. It's probably going to, the secondary and tertiary effects of that
Yep.
high transit time do add up and potentially set you back down the road.
Yeah, so I would much rather reduce meal frequency and have meals that are slower transit time and more nutrient dense and go that route if I have to. I'm gonna go that way every time if that's better for me, you know. Um, and I think and I want to put one thing out here because I think that when you hear this, I think that most people, because a lot of people that follow me too, they they think that you can just execute an entire growth phase without ever having any digestive distress. That is not true.
I've heard you say that on a number of podcasts now.
I'm
And
going
it
to
seems
say
like,
it's not true
yeah, for sure.
for most people.
Well,
And
especially
I
if you're trying
think
to put on a lot of weight.
is it true for some people? Yes, but it's it's not going to be true for everyone just for the simple fact that you're tipping the scales, man. Like you're going to have some digestive distress by the end of that. It's just really like how much is okay, how much is not okay, how quickly can we fix it. If you're spending half of your growth phase miserable, that might be bad. Like that might be a sign. But if you're pretty full and you're maybe struggling a bit by the end and you're like, man, I'm really ready to be done with this, fair, fine, no problem. We'll
Yeah.
fix that pretty quick. As soon as we lower food, that fermentation will drop. Bacteria is going to cool off. Inflammation is going to cool off. We're golden. But we
Mm.
shouldn't be getting 4 weeks into this, when someone's like, I just started my growth phase and I'm miserable. Okie dokie. Well, what
Okie dokie.
what are we gonna do? Like, what do you want me to do?
Yeah. Well, I guess we got
So
to give you a
that's
gut protocol.
and I would even go as far as to say that I have a handful of guys that, including myself, that need high food. Just expect that we're gonna have to do some gut cleanup after every single growth phase, every time, no
Yeah.
matter what.
It's dude, this is something for me, like, I never had to worry about this sort of thing. And now all of a sudden it's like my main concern is how did that meal digest?
Yeah.
Like eating mindfully after and like journaling about my poops. I'm like, this is fucking
Paul,
bullshit.
I'm picturing Paul getting up, not making his bed, but he
Yeah.
is he is kneeling over the toilet and writing in his journal about his stool.
Number 4 on the Bristol chart. No pushing.
And
Good.
then and then he and then he messages, and then he texts me. He's like, "Hey, I got a number 4 this morning, very minimal pushing." I'm like, "Good. Go. Have a great day."
Hey, listen, we haven't started working together, but we will work together in the future. You're getting those texts, buddy.
I look forward to it. I so yeah, I mean, I think a just realizing that functional health, digestion, hormones for a competitor is different than functional health for a lifestyle client, just for the
Yeah.
simple fact that the reality is that you're gonna run into problems at times. You just are. I don't even care if you're working with me, even as someone as in tune with this. Yeah, we're gonna run into some shit once in a while. We'll fix it, but it's gonna happen, you
Listen,
know?
there are analogs to be like, I use the same kind of verbiage when I speak to a lot of my strength athletes. It's like when you're pushing the envelope to try to do things that your body does not want to do, like is
Right.
threatening safety, there are going to be risks that you run into. You're going to have niggles here and there. You're going to have tweaks. You're going to have, we're going to overshoot your recovery and have some CNS fatigue. It's going to happen. But the thing is, do we have the strategies in place to mitigate those as we go so that we can continue to make progress?
Yep. You have good baseline strategies. You're not ignoring problems. That's important.
Exactly. Yep.
And you are, you know, when we're talking about muscle growth, we're also realizing that realizing that taking a step back now might give us three to five steps forward later. Like you have to don't use some foresight,
Yep.
right? Foresight foresight is one of the best tools that any of us could ever possess. And of course, it's the least frequently used tool by competitors because we want everything right now, you know?
And I'm gonna tie this whole conversation back to the conversation we started on. It's like, let's look at what's actually happening and not try to use drugs to blanket the situation, right?
Yep.
We're not trying to use drugs uh to band-aid a shitty situation. We're using them to amplify the effects of whatever it is that we're doing.
Yeah. Pharmaceuticals, supplements, even
Yeah, sure.
to an extent, are preventative and they're proactive. Are they reactive sometimes? Yes, sometimes, but they shouldn't be solely reactive, right?
Agreed. Yeah, for sure.
Because otherwise we're just Western medicine, you know, like
Oh,
we're
that's a
just
whole
doing the
other.
same, you know, doing the same thing.
Switching gears a little bit, I have a question for you about aromatase inhibitors with females. Now, on the strength athlete side, this isn't something that's going to be ever used, really.
Sure.
But I've seen some really ridiculous recommendations for females using aromatase inhibitors, especially in the context of contest prep, where as you're getting leaner, you have less aromatase anyway. As you're getting leaner, you're producing less estrogen anyway.
Yep.
And if you are enhanced, the likelihood of you taking aromatizing compounds is probably zero
Especially as you get closer, you
as
know.
as you get closer to the show. So maybe if you could speak on what the purpose of the aromatase inhibitor would be, and then which one and why would you be implementing it?
So speaking on some of those practices, we should give an example first
Absolutely,
so we
yeah.
know. So, I've seen, if you're around long enough, you see things that other people do, right? So,
Oh yeah.
an example may be that female client taking non-aromatizing compounds, let's say like Anavar Primo, something like that, maybe
Mhm.
both, maybe, a few things, whatever it is. They're taking these things for long durations of time, maybe the whole prep, perhaps with no aromatizing compound. They are being, it's being suggested to them that they utilize something like, Arimidex
Mhm.
potentially, right? Or letrozole, even
Ugh.
perhaps, which is a pretty strong aromatase inhibitor, right? Per milligram, very strong. Um, or both at the same time. I've seen that one
Shut the
where
fuck up.
they're actually stacked. Oh, I've seen that one quite a few times where they're using both at the same time, which by the way is completely redundant and from a mechanistic standpoint doesn't even make sense because why? Like, it's like
Uh,
it's like taking three types of nearly the, almost identical things. So with that being said, why would that not make sense? Well, you already kind of mentioned the reasons, right? When
Hmm.
your intro there is A, if you aren't taking aromatizing compounds, then you're not aromatizing the compounds because they don't
Right.
aromatize. B, you're taking compounds that slow down or completely shut down your endogenous hormone output. And if you're someone that's been using PEDs long time, you probably don't have endogenous hormone output anyhow, you
Hmm.
know. And C, you're lean, so fat cells produce aromatase, right? So we have those are shrunk, those are very small. So we have less of that going on. So what how much estrogen, if we took nothing, if we took no aromatase inhibitor, how much estrogen's in your system? Maybe none. Maybe very little, right? If
Right.
we were to draw labs, it's going to be the undetectable amount, less than 5 on the labs. Like you're
Right.
not going to see it. So what would be the point of even taking something like that is the question. And the point
And
is that,
for reference, like I've never used an aromatase inhibitor with any of my female clients. I've never felt like I needed to.
right, is it really necessary? I would say probably not. It's probably not necessary. Now, are there women that are going to have estrogen still present in their system? Yeah, some will, for sure.
Mhm.
Is there maybe a less aggressive, or is there maybe a less aggressive way that we could go about it? Sure, we could potentially use something like a Nolvadex, like a SERM, right?
Hmm.
That would that would give us a little bit of extra blanket there. That way, if there is any estrogen that we want to get rid of, like right at the end of that prep, we have something that's not necessarily reducing total estrogen as much as it is just blocking it at the receptor primarily.
So clarify this for me. This a SERM, my understanding, something like Nolvadex, for example, it's only blocking it at certain receptors.
Not all of them, right?
So why would if so what's the significance of those certain receptors that we would want to block action there, but not systemically?
So it doesn't, you're right. It doesn't systemically block it, but it will block it primarily in those areas of heavier estrogen receptor activity. So
So
for
love
women,
handles.
glutes,
Mhm.
stuff like that.
Okay.
Where women typically struggle, women have, assuming they have the typical like female fat pattern, right? Which
Right.
is glutes, hamstrings, quads, maybe a little bit. Women
Mhm.
don't tend to have a typical female pat pattern. They don't tend to have the abdominal fat as much when they get lean like that. Um, so it does more or less block it in the areas that we want it to block it in. And
Gotcha.
I think the other advantage of that too is that if there is any estrogen left in the system, at least when we remove that, there's that reboot process, if you will, is a little bit easier right afterwards, because it's just like remove drug, whatever's left in there can kind of continue, start to do its thing again, right?
Right. So there's
Versus,
no rebound. Yeah.
yeah, and again, is it, I think that yes, that makes sense. There's going to be less rebound, but also you have to realize that with people doing those types of protocols, their estrogen's already going to be low by the end, probably.
Oh yeah.
So there's going to be a reboot period regardless of how you slice it. But I think that going back to your original topic, it's more so that the stacking of these aromatase inhibitors or the overutilization of them just literally doesn't actually make sense if you understand what they do.
Oh, without question. I think, well, the other piece there is like if there was estrogen present, which chances are there's likely none
And you guys can check it if you want. I mean, draw some labs. I don't know, if you want.
if you want. But I think at that point, like that little bit of estrogen present is not what's limiting your conditioning. It's that you're fat still.
Yeah, and you also we also know that estrogen's important for fat loss, nutrient partitioning anyhow. So like it's even more problematic when these things are being utilized for really long periods of time, or they are potentially utilizing all non-aromatizing compounds the whole way through for long durations,
Mm,
that becomes more problematic. I will say that women outside of like very advanced women that are taking higher dosages of stuff, if you're taking a pretty moderate dosage, I don't want to say that you'll be fully suppressed because you might not be. You might you might not be fully suppressed in the way that as soon as a male takes TRT, it's like, you
right.
know, it's like LHFSH or zero, it's
Mm,
gone. In women,
point
if you're
three.
other,
Thank you very much.
yeah, in women, if you're otherwise functioning relatively normally before the prep, and maybe you're kind of a lower level, or I want to say lower level, maybe you're a newer user and you're taking pretty small amounts, you might have some hormone production through the prep.
Mm,
Maybe you might maintain your menstrual cycle for a little while through the prep, maybe even maybe the whole time, maybe
if you're very
not
resilient.
often. There are I've had a few that were enhanced that maintain cycle the whole way. It is not common. especially especially if you're actually getting lean enough, if you're actually getting lean enough. Yeah, if you're like 10 weeks out condition, then don't even like, you're not in this conversation. It's not the same
We're
thing.
okay. So when we're talking about estrogen manipulation, at what point do we have to have a conversation with our client about risk profile? Because obviously, I think it's very understated how valuable estrogen is for health. And I think, especially in the context of female athletes, I would put aromatase inhibitors in that like higher risk category. Am I
Yeah,
wrong?
well, I would say from from a short-term standpoint, if we're just talking prep, yes, but also I would venture to say too that a lot of people that have those really low estrogen profiles, they might have those all the time. That's where we're that's where we're really running into issues. You're essentially just operating in, a menopausal state at that point, right?
Right.
So cardiac risk,
Hmm.
stroke risk, um, protection of bone health, of course, you
Brain
know,
health. Yeah.
brain health, liver health, like all these, essentially all your organs
Yeah.
are going to be impacted to some extent by estrogen's presence. And on top of that, a lot of our systems rely on a balance between the actual sex hormones, not just how much of estrogen's there, how much progesterone's there. It's more so like how much of each is there and at what balance. And of course, each woman's resilience is a little different. Some don't notice side effects. Some don't really feel those side effects. But if we think about, hormone replacement, why would they give a woman, estrogen in hormone replacement if it wasn't beneficial? You know, they would just let them hang out at low estrogen forever and they'd be fine. But we know that that's not the case. We know that there are health risks involved. So these women that are probably even in their 20s, man, like even in their mid 20s, having these super low estrogen profiles for a decade, and then they
Hmm.
stop competing, and their endogenous hormone production is obviously probably not going to come back at that point.
Right.
And if they're not supported properly, like they've already taken 10 years off of that. They basically have accumulated 10 years of damage there,
Hmm.
essentially, when they could have, if they were going to go down that route of PEDs or being enhanced, they could have utilized, an HRT that at least had testosterone in there, at least had
Hmm.
some aromatization, maybe had an estrogen, maybe not. Um, but walking around with these chronically low estrogen profiles for years and years on end is dangerous.
I mean, that brings in the whole question of like birth control as well within that conversation. But I think that's a bit of a rabbit hole we'll save for another time, perhaps.
But you see cardiac risk with birth control.
Absolutely, for
So there
sure.
you go.
Last question, because I want to be mindful of time. And I know this is a bit of a deep rabbit hole to go down as well. I'm seeing a much higher prevalence of thyroid hormone prescription. Well, I use the word prescription, recommendation from coaches. In contest prep, I get the rationale. Food is
Sure.
low, thyroid function comes down. throw in a replacement 12.5, 25 micrograms, ride it out for the prep. We're not using it for fat loss. We're using it to prevent thyroid shutdown and metabolic adaptation. I get
Yep.
it.
Yep.
Thyroid use off season. Now, I know for a fact that GH does reduce T4 to some degree with higher dosages. But if food is high, why would one use T4 and potentially combination therapy T3 in an off-season scenario?
I'll tell you why. I know the exact reason why.
Yeah, hit me.
Because they like to take drugs.
I
That's the reason.
don't doubt it. Yeah.
Well, I think that for the consumer, for the client, either the client does, for one, the client doesn't really, maybe doesn't fully understand how the thyroid works. Fair, it's fine.
Yep.
So and a lot of them just genuinely think that, like, hey man, like this is another, this is another pharmaceutical. It's going to help me. It's going to make me a bigger, better bodybuilder. So they just take it. Like, and
Devil's
they
advocate.
don't know any different.
I'm going to play devil's advocate because I love doing it. Thyroid hormone is a very big regulator of metabolism. So if we're having higher protein turnovers, higher nutrient turnovers, could that potentially lead to more effective partitioning, hypertrophy response, anything in there? Is there a potential benefit here, or is it over?
So you are 100% correct, except that if you were comparing someone that was hypothyroid versus normal thyroid function, then yes, the person with normal thyroid function would be better regulated metabolically. Their liver would detox better. Their gut would work better. Everything would work better. Protein synthesis would be better. But I guess the question is it beneficial to be above that point?
Super physiological.
So, and the answer to that is probably not, just for the simple fact that that speeding up of these processes will also start to cause issues, right? So we don't want the processes are meant to go at a certain speed. So like when you see a range of thyroid, and we of course are using more tighter windows on our labs and things, of course, right? But if you thought, okay, well, our free T3 should be a 3 to a 4 or something, that's considered optimal, right? Like that's the
Right.
point, is that level is going to regulate those processes efficiently, properly. So going above that would not be beneficial. Now, second thing is that when we're taking these exogenous thyroid, we're effectively probably just shutting off our endogenous thyroid production. So
Thyroid does function similar to the testes, where if you are
yeah,
taking
it will.
any exogenous at any amount, that your natural thyroid's shutting down.
Yeah, it's going to shut down, if not all the way, pretty close to it.
Okay.
So sometimes people will, like, well, I'm going to throw, I'm taking, I'll take growth hormone, so I'll throw in 75 or 100 micrograms of T4. Fair. Okay. One, I really, really doubt that short-term adaptation when you take the growth hormone is going to last very long. It's all that's going to happen is your TSH is going to go up real slightly and your thyroid production is going to kick up and you're fine. Like, it's not going to last forever.
Yep.
If you have a normally functioning thyroid, your body's going to so easily compensate for that. It's not even going to be, it's a non-issue. And the second thing is, now what you've done is you've inputted an exogenous thyroid, and you've took your endogenous thyroid that was probably fine to begin with, and you shut it down. Or even worse is when people take exogenous dosages that aren't even high enough. And so they're like shutting down their endogenous production, and
Right.
they're effectively like lowering their thyroid level at the same time. Oh
Perfect.
God. Excellent. So
Excellent.
there you go. Yeah.
That was wonderfully executed. Because
Yeah.
I felt the same way. Whenever I see things, listen, I don't purport to be like a drug guru. I have a very solid understanding of these things. And in most cases, I can spot bullshit because I know how they work. I think there's a massive benefit to the availability of science and the availability of data these days. And the amount of education available to us on these compounds, when I came into this, there was nothing. But the more you know, the more you can rationalize.
Yeah. You, and I think that when we're talking about, and you could really think about this with any pharmaceutical that you're adding into your stack.
Hmm.
You're thinking that if I take this, it does this, but you fail to realize that there's an entire feedback loop that is going to be affected by these inputs. You know, whether that's thyroid, whether that's another ancillary drug, whatever it is, it's not like a 1 + 1 = 2. It's like 1 + 1 = 10, you know. So there's
Exactly.
always something else down the chain that maybe it's not affected right now. Maybe it's not a huge issue right now, but it may be an issue later down the line. Just like the insulin thing. It's like, yes, we can keep controlling our blood sugar forever, but now we're going to create
Eventually, you're
massive
diabetic.
insulin resistance,
Yeah.
right?
No one wants to be a
So
fat diabetic.
now I always joke that off air we make lots of like bodybuilder jokes, like the insulin appetite joke that I made
Yeah,
prior.
yeah.
But the I always make the one that the only reason that a lot of bodybuilders aren't type 2 diabetic is because they periodically prep. And it revert they're
It's
like
so true though.
diabetic reverse it,
Dude,
speed it
it's so
up.
true.
And that's probably about the only thing that's probably the only thing that really separates them from an actual type 2 diabetic is, well, they weight train, but they just get lean once in a while. And so they fix it and then they go back and break it again.
That's pretty much what we do with everything.
Yeah, you're right. Fair enough.
Dude, thank you so much for joining me. This was very insightful for me, and I hope our listeners got a little glimpse into the nuance of how things go.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
All right. I will have links to Austin's reappearance on the podcast, where to find him and how to get a hold of him if you have any need for education, mentorship, coaching. It'll all be in the show notes. Austin, thanks so much.
Thank you, buddy. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks everyone for listening. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications, and we'll catch you on the next one.